Coming up, Dr. Joseph Glatthaar will present General Lee's Army and the declining margin for error. Dr. Glatthaar has taught at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, the U.S. Army War College, the U.S. Military Academy, and the University of Houston. He is currently the Stevenson Distinguished Professor of History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's the author of a number of books, including Soldiering in the Army of Northern Virginia, a statistical portrait of the troops who served under Robert E. Lee, General Lee's Army, From Victory to Collapse, Forgotten Allies, the Oneida Indians in the American Revolution with James Kirby Martin, The Civil War in the West, 1863 to 1865, Partners in Command, Relationships Between Civil War Leaders, and Forged in Battle, the Civil War Alliance of Black Soldiers and White Officers. Please welcome Dr. Joseph Glatthaar.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me fine in the back? No problem? Great. It's a real treat to be here on this 150th anniversary, almost, of the Battle of Gettysburg. Today I'm going to talk about Lee's Army and the dwindling margin for error. The Confederate strategy, as most of you probably know, was to punish invaders as close to the borders of the Confederacy as was possible. The objective was to discourage future attacks and also to convince the Northern public that attempts to conquer the Confederacy would be futile. Jefferson Davis wrote, quote, "Resist invasion as far as may be practicable and repel the invaders whenever and however it may be done," end quote. Because citizens and soldiers lived along avenues of invasion, Davis wanted the Confederacy to fight to protect all Confederate territory. The protection was absolutely necessary. Quote, "The evacuation of any portion of territory involves not only the loss of supplies, but in every instance has been attended by a greater or less loss of troops," end quote. Now, every strategy has its flaws, particularly one in which you are fighting an enemy which has vastly superior manpower and resources, as the Confederacy was doing. But Davis and others believed by utilizing their resources more efficiently and by tapping Confederate soldiers and civilians' commitment to the cause and requiring them to endure greater hardships than their enemy, they could win the war. Still, they were fighting a war with a limited margin for error. And as the war went on, that margin for error was slowly stripped away. Now, for the Confederacy, there would be enormous hardships, sacrifices, and tragedies. They would have to stretch manpower and resources to the breaking point, and they would have to incur heavy losses in delivering those powerful blows as close to the boundaries as was possible against the enemy. Nevertheless, Davis believed the Confederate people could endure any sacrifice for freedom and independence. Quote, "We will do all that can be done by pluck and muscle, endurance and dogged courage, dash and red-hot patriotism," end quote. No Confederate military force fulfilled that strategy better than the Army of Northern Virginia. Despite dwindling supplies and manpower and enormous hardships, the Army of the Potomac continued to resist vigilantly until the very late stages of the war, when virtually everything collapsed within the Confederacy, including the Army of Northern Virginia. Now, the Army of Northern Virginia had to utilize its manpower and resources effectively, but neither of its two early commanders, Joseph E. Johnston or Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, were very good at doing so. 3 times they abandoned positions, Harper's Ferry, Northern Virginia, and the Manassas-Centerville axis, and in each instance there was massive destruction that not only damaged the Confederate effort to prosecute the war, it also sent the wrong message to the troops. The message it sent was, of course, that it was okay to destroy supplies, that there would be a virtually unlimited amount of them. So what it did was it encouraged indiscipline and convinced the soldiers to pay little credence to the value of preserving those resources. Again, reducing the margin for error. Now, every organization has a culture, and the Army of Northern Virginia was no different from it. It derived its culture from two elements. One, what the individuals who made up the Army brought from civil life, and secondly, their military experiences and training. In today's military, we send individuals to boot camp to break down their traditions, those ideas that they bring in from civil life, and try and remold them in a different way to make them more effective soldiers. But in the Civil War, there was no such experience. And to make matters worse, the officers who were supposed to inculcate discipline came from that society themselves. So they came from the society, they shared all those cultural issues, they were learning on the job, and they failed to rigorously discipline their men. In effect, the culture of the Army of Northern Virginia emerged from the bottom up. At core, virtually all citizen soldiers shared the same fundamental beliefs in the rightness of secession and slavery. From society, they had inherited a concept we call Southern honor, an overarching theme that embraced powerful perceptions of manhood, integrity, independence, valor, kinship, esteem, and among the elite, both luxury and generosity. Now, these were really great qualities for soldiers. But the problem was, it also encouraged a lack of discipline, and among the wealthier, a spirit of profligacy and self-indulgence that were acceptable in peacetime life in Southern society, but weren't good qualities for armies. And this isn't, say, individualism, which you could harness and focus in a more effective way. This is a much more destructive concept. And it ultimately damaged the Civil War soldiers and Lee's army. These are extremely good, motivated, courageous soldiers, but that discipline factor became a real source of problem over the course of the war. And of course, if you're trying to utilize your resources effectively, the lack of discipline became a huge, huge burden. Now, in the Battle of Seven Pines on the 31st of May, 1862, Joseph E. Johnston was badly wounded. Robert E. Lee ultimately succeeded him, quote unquote, temporarily. That temporarily meant the rest of the war. When Lee stepped into that position, he had two huge problems. One, of course, was kind of a minor issue. The Union Army was at the gates of Richmond. But on top of that, he had serious problems within the Army itself. Administrative and discipline problems were rampant in the Army. Staff officers were sloppy, soldiers weren't getting fed, they weren't getting equipped properly, and as a result, that was encouraging greater indiscipline within the ranks. Now, Lee had this great reputation from the U.S. Military Academy. As you know, he graduated second in his class. By the way, he did graduate with 0 demerits, but other individuals in his class also had 0 demerits. He wasn't the only soldier who ever graduated with no demerits. But that's neither here nor there in this talk. He had excellent service in the war with Mexico. You probably know that in a letter, Winfield Scott described Lee as the finest soldier in the U.S. Army. Yet within certain circumstances, certain circles, there was an undercurrent of doubt about Lee. In May 1861, after exposure to Lee over the previous 6 years, Edmund Kirby Smith had come to the conclusion that he lacked the ability for large-scale command, describing his selection to head the Virginia forces as, quote-unquote, unfortunate. Smith, like numerous others, was put off by Lee's slowness to come to a decision. Sam Melton, who served on Brigadier General Millage L. Bonham's staff and had a very favorable impression of Lee, informed his wife in 1861, Lee, quote, is a splendid officer, slow, too slow, but thoroughly accomplished, end quote. And in a letter that has become almost famous for its misreading of the man, South Carolina Governor Francis W. Pickens announced to Bonham just before the Battle of First Manassas, the truth is Lee is not with us at heart, or he is a common man with good looks and too cautious for practical revolution, end quote. That should alert you that you want to be really careful when you judge people in writing, because posterity will carve you up The great thing we remember about Pickens, who was a wartime governor of South Carolina, is that he so grossly misjudged the finest military figure, perhaps in the Civil War, certainly on the Confederate side. But even Lee's trusted staff officer, Walter H. Taylor, complained to his fiancée about Lee's slowness to arrive at a decision. He is too undecided, takes too long to firm his conclusions. After Lee's first campaign, which was a failure amid the rugged terrain of Western Virginia, his reputation plummeted even more. Fueled by excessively optimistic newspaper accounts as the campaign was unfolding, soldiers and civilians alike acted as if Lee had committed some irretrievable blunder when they suffered the setback in Western Virginia. Newspaperman Edward A. Pollard, a sharp critic of the Davis administration, determined, quote, the most remarkable circumstance of this campaign was that it was conducted by a general who had never fought a battle, who had a pious horror of guerrillas, and whose extreme tenderness of blood induced him to depend exclusively upon the resources of strategy to essay the achievement of victories without the cost of life, end quote. A student at West Point when Lee was superintendent, Ben Alston, reported to his father that people referred to Lee as a dirt dauber, a small insect that leaves a soiled trail in its wake. Alexander C. Haskell, a family friend of the Lees, described to his mother satirical sketches he had seen of Lee, quote, with a double-barrel spyglass in one hand and a spade in the other, reconnoitering positions of the enemy. The caption read, to retreat a little and throw up fortifications the instant he sets eyes upon them, end quote. Haskell believed, quote, it is unjust to a fine officer, but it does somewhat exhibit his very cautious policy, end quote. To remove Lee from the spotlight, Davis transferred him to the Department of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, where he did some good service. But that was hardly a job for the third highest ranking individual in the Confederate States of America's Army. And as spring 1862 approached, Davis recalled Lee because he needed him at his side. The reaction was hostile. The appointment of General Lee as chief military advisor of the president looks like a fatal mistake, Thomas Preston commented. Lee's, quote, traits of mind, end quote, would prove more problematic than they were the previous year, he predicted. May God in mercy protect us. Catherine Edmonston, a North Carolinian and an unusually perceptive critic and diarist, held Lee in utter contempt. He is too timid, believes too much in masterly inactivity, finds his strength too much in sitting still, she recorded. Even Lee's counterpart on the Union side, Major General George B. McClellan, rejoiced when he thought that Lee in his new position would replace Johnston as the field commander. I prefer Lee to Johnston, he elaborated to the president. The former is too cautious and weak under grave responsibility. Personally brave and energetic to a fault, he yet is wanting in moral firmness when pressed by heavy responsibility and is likely to be timid and irresolute in action, end quote. Psychologists and psychiatrists call this projection. Yet in his job as commander of Virginia forces, and his job as advisor to the president, Lee gained great insight into the resources and manpower that the Confederacy could commit to the war. He fully understood that the Confederacy had a very limited margin for error and that it needed to conserve resources as well as make a commitment to endure enormous hardships to win its independence. Now, as the new Army commander, Lee began immediately to institute changes. He changed the name. In Special Orders Number 22 on June 1st, 1862, he referred to it as the Army of Northern Virginia. Others had referred to it by that name before, but under Lee, the name started to stick, and it remained the Army of Northern Virginia over the long haul. He established and enforced routines for the distribution of supplies and required division commanders to scrutinize the administration of their divisions to make sure everyone was fed. So soldiers in one unit, artillery battery, were actually trapping rats and soaking them in water and frying them because they weren't being issued food, and they were 5 miles from Richmond. Not a good thing. He circulated directives to all officers to pay attention to, quote, the health and comfort of the men under his command. Lee wanted all the soldiers to be in good health because he knew he was going to seize the offensive. Lee even issued whiskey rations for health benefits when essential. Lee cracked down on lost or damaged supplies, which hindered the war effort severely. Quote, the increasing difficulty in replacing them makes greater watchfulness and care necessary in their preservation. 1 week later, he complained that the means of supply are becoming more limited while the demand continues great. On his daily rides around the Army, he wrote that he, quote, observed that with concern in passing through camps too much disregard to the proper preservation of public property. And he was, quote, firmly convinced that our success is mainly dependent upon the economical and proper appropriation of public property at all times. So Lee is really on top of these matters. He began gathering intelligence and ordered Stuart to take a ride. Of course, he didn't order him to ride all the way around the Union Army, but he wanted a ride to find out where the Union position was. He directed sharpshooters and artillerists to pepper Union forces who were trying to build fortifications, and at the same time, he began building fortifications. Now, in this instance, he was challenging a naive cultural perspective on warfare for Confederates. Soldiers thought they would just slug it out in the open field, whip the Yankees, and that'd be the end of it. Life doesn't always work out like that way. Laboring was not part of their impression of the duties of a soldier. Quote, our people are opposed to work, Lee communicated to Davis. Our troops, officers, community, and press all ridicule and resist it. He then went on to point out that McClellan was using his troops for laborers. Quote, why should we leave to him the whole advantage of laborers? Combined with valor, fortitude, and boldness, of which we have no fair proportion, it should lead us to success. After describing how effectively the Romans used fortifications, Lee concluded, there is nothing so military as labor and nothing so important to our army as to save the lives of the soldiers. He issued orders that each division would assign 300 men to the construction of earthworks, and on top of that, other soldiers would be involved in improving their positions, building abattis, those are the cross sticks that you've probably seen on battlefields, and other things that would strengthen their defensive lines. Of course, the naive folks thought that that was because Lee was going to fight on the defensive. What Lee was really thinking was, we want to prepare strong defensive works so we can use a very small portion of our army to defend and the rest of them to attack. So Lee began to take very effective steps, and sure enough, the troops fought, and they did well. They won the 7 days battles and then took the campaign into northern Virginia, taking Second Manassas and driving the Yankees from nearly all of Virginia and taking the war into Maryland. After 3 months of fighting, however, Lee knew that he had serious discipline problems. Lee believed, quote, the material of which it is composed is the best in the world, and nothing can surpass the gallantry and intelligence of the main body. But soldiers brought with them from civil life and qualities and motivations that made Confederates both the best infantrymen in the world, but also it injured the Army in other ways. Had the Confederacy organized their units differently, Lee wrote, had they not been introduced prematurely into combat without adequate training and regimentation, and had they not endured a series of harsh conditions, hard marches, and frequent campaigns and battles, Lee felt they might have been able to alter the military culture. But the demands of war permitted no such opportunity. By the time Lee was in a position to implement any changes, he encountered 3 major difficulties. First, military culture had already settled in and had seized hold of the troops, and it would be difficult to break. Second, officers upon whom he would have to rely came from the same background as his soldiers, and so they shared the same values in civil life. And then the third element was that furloughed soldiers and new recruits were coming in and replenishing the culture from civil life, keeping the soldiers well aware of their old bad habits. That, however, did not stop Lee from trying. After Antietam in September 1862, Lee directed Stonewall Jackson and James Longstreet, his two wing commanders, to, quote, infuse a different spirit among our officers and to inspire them in making every necessary effort to bring about a better state of discipline. They must, quote, impress men and officers with the importance of a change necessary to the preservation of this Army and its successful accomplishment of its mission, as its better discipline, greater mobility, and higher inspirations must counterbalance the many advantages over us, both in numbers and material, which the enemy possess. But those who were expected to inculcate discipline, the officer corps, had suffered very heavy losses. For the entire war, almost a quarter of all people who ever served as an officer in the Army of Northern Virginia were killed in action. In addition, one of every two was either wounded at least once or was killed in action. From 7 days through Antietam, some 600 Confederate officers were killed during those months. 600 officers in that short space of time, with over 2,000 more of them wounded. By the summer of 1864, the Army would suffer close to 1,000 more officers killed since Antietam and another 4,000 wounded. So you do the math. I added up to equal 1,600 officers killed in action from the day Lee took over till midsummer 1864, and another 6,000 wounded in action. Those are staggering losses. Now, the Confederacy had a finite quantity of quality officers, and these losses impaired its ability to train and discipline the troops. As Lee wrote Davis in mid-1864, what our officers most lack is the pains and labor of inculcating discipline. It is a painful and tedious process and is not apt to win popular favor. Lee believed his enlisted men lacked discipline, and the officers could not instill it because they lacked discipline themselves. Even worse, well, I should say that if there was one good thing, the replacement officers were usually individuals who had performed exceedingly well in battle. So at least you had really good combat officers, but anyone who's ever been in the military knows there's more to being an officer than simply commanding in combat. There's the assurance of discipline, making sure that the unit is administered properly, the troops are fed, cared for, clothing, their needs are taken care of, their morale is maintained, and on and on and on. Even worse than the losses of officers, supply and transportation problems became so severe that soldiers began to take matters into their own hands. Now, you look around the room, and most of the people here are adults, and we know that young people can eat gargantuan quantities of food. And most of these soldiers had no idea how to cook, and they were unaccustomed to eating bad food. A Georgia private grumbled of eating biscuits so hard, quote, I could knock a bull down with one. I like this one. This one guy described the first time he tried to bake bread. The first time I made up dough, I had a mess of it, stuck to my hands, and I could hardly get it off. Then I tried to bake it, but I could not get it done. Some was burnt up and some was raw. What a mess I had. What makes the story perfect is the guy's name was Bacon. My favorite cooking story, though, is this mess. A mess is a group of usually 4 to 8 people who eat their meals together, stole what they thought was a little barrel of lard and made biscuits. But when the biscuits were almost done, somebody came by and pointed out, that wasn't lard, that's tallow. But one of the guys in the mess insisted on trying them and pronounced them really good biscuits, but he couldn't convince anyone else to eat any of them, so the endeavor failed. Those stories were early in the war. Then the shortages kicked in. In an average year, this is peacetime, 800,000 to 1 million bushels of wheat were shipped to Richmond. In 1862, even though the city's population had doubled and the Army ranged from anywhere from 70 to 80,000 men, only 250,000 to 300,000 bushels arrived. By mid-January 1863, the Army supply of cattle had dwindled down to enough to last through the end of the month only. And those cattle naturally had gotten really thin because they're grazing in the wintertime. With regard to the other white meat, pork, the standard joke in Lee's army was that the bacon outranks General Lee. In late April and early May 1863, rations for a single day had to be stretched over 3 days. By early January 1864, Davis admitted that the Army issued 1/4 pound of meat per man per day, and Lee only had 1 day's issue on hand. How can you run an army when you don't have food for the next day for your entire army? When the Yankees quipped that the Confederates had a new general, General Starvation, they were not far from telling the truth. With shortages, soldiers took matters into their own hands. First, they began purchasing and then stealing from locals. By late 1863, though, there was nothing left to pilfer, and as an Alabama private asserted, hunger will drive a man to anything, you may depend. The Confederate government admitted in 1863 alone 617,000 pounds of bacon were stolen. According to the Assistant Commissary of Subsistence in January 1864, every shipment of meat is robbed of from 8 to 1,500 pounds. To combat the practice, the Confederacy had to place armed guards on supply trains. Lee tried to solve the food problem. As a solution, Lee suggested that the Confederacy alter its consumption habits. If it requires all the meat in the country to support the Army, it should be had. And I believe this could be accomplished by not only showing its necessity, but that all equally contributed and that it was faithfully applied. If the government could convince the public to consume foodstuffs that, quote, cannot be so well used by the troops in the field, end quote, it would save other eatables for his men. Clothing, too, was a big problem. As one soldier complained about his clothes, they were, quote, more holy than righteous. Shortages of coats, hats, and pants were epidemic problems, but shoes were always the biggest problem, and replacement items were oftentimes poor quality. In one shipment, Lee's army got 10,000 pair, of which it had to send back over 3,000 of them as being unfit. How did Lee deal with the problem? He assigned 271 soldiers who were shoemakers before the war to ply their trade during the winter months. It was not enough. Soldiers accustomed to solving problems themselves in civilian life took matters into their own hands. Early on in the war, they had plundered on the battlefields for money and valuables, weapons, and mementos. By late 1862, they had no choice but to plunder for food and clothing. As cold weather approached once again, soldiers hoped for a battle so that they could clothe themselves that winter. Listen to my words. They were hoping to get in a battle so they could get clothes for the winter months. Quote, in fact, the majority of the troops are eager for a fight, one officer wrote his father. The battlefield is the greatest storehouse of winter equipments and pocket money, and our boys have a penchant for both. One Virginia private concurred, quote, I have rather been in hopes that if we were going to fight at all, it would come off, for I want some overcoats and blankets. If our men whipped them, I would stand a good chance to get some, end quote. Animals. Spring of 1862, the artillery was short 1,200 animals. Spring of 62, 1,200 animals short. But if they had them, they couldn't have fed them, so I guess it didn't really make much of a difference. In early 1863, Lee directed subordinates to feed their animals on twigs and bark of poplars, maples, and sweet gums because he couldn't get food supplies for them. In the latter part of 1863, Lee had to reduce the number of guns in his artillery because he couldn't get sufficient horses to pull them, and he didn't have the food to feed those horses. By November 1863, Lee complained to Davis, no corn was received here on the 21st and 23rd, and on the 22nd and 24th, about 5 pounds per horse. 2.5 pounds per day was about 1/10 of what the Union Army fed its animals. In the course of a 40-day period without any campaigning, a cavalry brigade increased its dismounted 292 to 681. as a result of food shortfalls. Prior to the secession crisis, the southern states had developed a transportation network that serviced distant markets predominantly with non-perishable goods, things like cotton, tobacco, and sugar. Most perishable items came locally. By the winter of 1862-63, the Confederacy had so overused its rail system in Virginia that it was becoming increasingly unreliable. Lee's army, of course, was located around the Rappahannock River, which meant that it was going to be serviced up near Fredericksburg. It was going to be serviced by the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad, which was not designed for freight. That left the Virginia Central, the workhorse of the state, as the only viable option. It intersected the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac in Hanover Junction. From there, it ran to Charlottesville and the Shenandoah Valley, which we know it was a truly rich agricultural region. What workers would have to do is unload foodstuffs from the rail at Hanover Junction, place them on wagons, and then move them up. Even worse, the Virginia Central was badly overused. Its tracks had declined significantly during the short space of the war, and its efficiency is most seriously impaired, an inspection reported. In mid-March 1863, the line suffered 4 derailments in a 5-day span. To reduce derailments, the officials had to cut the weight in each car by 25% and reduce the speed dramatically. Lee proposed a solution. By early 1864, Lee sought the suspension of all rail travel except on government business, with the excess space devoted to supplying the armies. In addition, Lee called for, quote, all the population whose presence would impede or endanger our efforts should be removed, especially that part of it which increases the consumption of public stores without aiding or strengthening the army. In other words, what Lee wanted were prisoners, parolees, federal deserters, unemployed persons moved from Richmond. He wanted massive depopulation of the city of Richmond because these people were consuming supplies. Every encouragement must be given to the rest of the non-combatant population to retire, except those whose services may be useful or who will not increase the scarcity of supplies. Pretty powerful words. As the Confederate margin for error winnowed in the area of supply and transportation, it declined severely in manpower as well. Effective implementation of Davis's strategy was costly. 4 of every 10 soldiers in Lee's army was either killed or wounded at least once, I should say, and 5 of every 9 was either killed, wounded, or captured before the final surrender. 5 of every 9. 1 in 16 suffered wounds in multiple battles, and another 1 in 10 were wounded and imprisoned. So what you're talking about is an army that endured stupendous losses. By factoring in those who died of disease, accidents, or were discharged for disabilities, almost 3 of every 4 soldiers who ever served in Lee's army was either killed, died of disease, wounded, captured, or discharged for disability. When you factor in those who deserted for the war, the tabulation goes up to about 80%. So if you survived the war and served in Lee's army, you were probably in some really remote and secure place, or you were the one of the luckiest people on planet Earth. Not only did these terrible losses damage the army, but they also hurt morale at home. Even in the face of resounding triumphs, casualties cut to the core of wartime support. Let's look at the state of North Carolina. North Carolina had narrowly embraced secession. But what fueled the fires of disaffection hugely were the losses that the state suffered in Lee's army. Behind Virginia, North Carolina sent the most troops to the Army of Northern Virginia in the spring and summer of 1863. At Chancellorsville, about 30% of all North Carolinians were killed, wounded, or captured, by far the greatest total and percentage of any state in Lee's army. The 7 highest totals of killed and wounded fell to North Carolina regiments in Chancellorsville. 2 months later at Gettysburg, this is after North Carolina sent 2 huge new brigades to Lee's army. North Carolina lost 46.4% of all its men in Lee's army, either killed, wounded, or captured. Although we don't pay much attention to it, the top 4 regimental casualty figures and 6 of the 7 highest occurred in North Carolina regiments at Gettysburg. North Carolina lost 1,782 more men than the next highest state. And that 1,782 amounted to more casualties than 8 other states suffered at the Battle of Gettysburg. So you get a sense of the truly lopsided losses for North Carolina. Then add to that October 1863, Bristow Station, when virtually all the casualties in the battle were North Carolinians, another 10% of the North Carolinians in Lee's army, and you start to see the problem. What we're dealing with is, by a rough estimate, about 70% of all North Carolinians in Lee's army, the most famous army in the Confederacy, were either killed, wounded, or captured in a 5.5-month period. Can you imagine how that damaged morale at home? If you were to take a time template and place it there, and then the rising disaffection for the war in North Carolina and place that over it, they would be identical. You see the losses in Lee's army triggering opposition to the war at home. To compensate for productivity decline associated with manpower losses, the Confederacy, of course, hoped to rely on blacks, but that proved futile. The black workers slowed down their work, they ran off to the Yankees, and caused general uneasiness among the population that remained at home. Furthermore, slavery in Virginia was so badly damaged by the war that the former governor of Virginia, Henry Wise, told one soldier, quote, "Slavery is a dead issue here in Virginia," end quote. In other words, even if the Confederacy won, they couldn't keep slaves in Virginia. Attrition wore down the Confederates as Lee tried desperately to increase manpower. They had a policy that they referred to as snatch-ups. If the army marched through a community and there was a guy who was of military age who seemed to be physically fit, they would snatch him up and put him in the army. That, of course, didn't get very many people, and Lee implored the Secretary of War to increase his manpower. In one instance, in an effort to increase manpower, Lee found himself under arrest. I'll bet most of you don't know that. What happened was, the Secretary of War assigned several individuals to be clerks. Lee didn't know who issued the order, but overturned it because he wanted them to be infantrymen. And when the Secretary of War found out his order had been overturned, he issued a warrant for Lee's arrest. Lee, of course, explained the situation when he found out, and guess what? The Secretary of War withdrew his original order, and the soldiers remained as infantrymen. Lee won the battle. The grind of the 1864 campaign took its toll on Lee's army. After 2 weeks of campaigning in May 1864, Lee had 6 generals killed, 9 generals wounded, and 3 generals captured. By the end of May, listen to this situation in Lee's high command. Longstreet was wounded and wouldn't come back till the fall. Ewell had collapsed from exhaustion and was out. A.P. Hill had a flare-up of his illness, repeated flare-ups. Stewart, of course, was killed in action, and Lee suffered from dysentery. And wait to hear this. Lee did not get more than 2 consecutive hours of sleep for the first 3 weeks of the campaign. That's incredible, isn't it? And that's according to the medical director for the Army. By early June, the campaign locked into trench warfare with all its harsh conditions. September 1862 through July 64, hospitals in Virginia had admitted almost 413,000 patients due to illness or injury. During the first 3 months of the 1864 campaign, May, June, and July, 102,000 soldiers were checked into Virginia hospitals. Now, some of those guys would be transferred from one hospital to another, but still 102,000 put in hospitals. That's incredible, isn't it? The grind was becoming devastating. Nor could Lee effectively replace those who went down. He had squeezed everyone he could in uniform back into ranks, and conscription had augmented his numbers too. But there was not much they could do. By the end of 1864, decreed the Bureau of Conscription, there were no more conscripts to tap except 16-year-olds who were coming of age. In Virginia, that amounted to only 2,719 young men. The strain of war proved unbearable. One brigade, for example, had 1,187 privates and had to defend 2,401 yards of parapet and 2,300 yards of picket every single day. That's not much space. By 1864, food for man and beast were becoming more and more scarce. Combat had discouraged farmers from planting in the Shenandoah Valley as far south as Bunker Hill, and a drought had devastated the corn crop between Stanton and Newmarket, reducing corn production to a third its usual level. Animals got 2.5 to 5 pounds of feed per day. As I mentioned before, Union animals got 23 to 26 pounds of feed per day. It was no better for humans. Had Cavalry Commander Wade Hampton not seized 2,500 head of cattle that summer, and it would have been a disaster for food. Of course, that only provided the Confederacy with a month's worth of meat, but it was still a pretty extraordinary achievement. As cold weather descended, life in the trenches became even worse. Soldiers seldom received more than a pound of cornmeal and a quarter pound of beef per day per man. By early 1865, the commissary could not even sustain that meager bounty. Soldiers often received a quarter pound of beef and either a pound of bread or 3/4 of a pound of cornmeal per day, between 900 and 1,200 calories. Let me give you a tip. The U.S. Army feeds its military personnel in a combat zone 4,000 calories per day, because that's what the U.S. Army believes is necessary to maintain body weight and muscle mass. These guys are living on on about a fourth of that. Many days the government couldn't supply both those things. It could only supply the starch or the meat. So it was a really serious problem. And of course, supplies came at a glacial pace. Lee had to draw supplies from as far south as Georgia, but as Sherman's army began advancing, that became problematic. Furthermore, one of the rail lines was so bad the trains traveled an average of 1 mile per hour because the tracks had fallen into such disrepair. It was not until the combination of Lincoln's re-election and Sherman's march that desertion began to soar. In 1865, it got worse and worse. Little clothing, little food, too little rest, too much work sapped soldiers of their motivation to fight. Good soldiers, tried soldiers, began to lose their faith and desert, men who had fought well in dozens of battles. Those final weeks were awful for Lee's men. Over the course of February and March, Lee's army lost an average of 120 men to desertion each day, comparable to an infantry brigade present for duty every 10 days. Others held on. On the retreat from Richmond-Petersburg line westward, their physical deterioration from poor conditioning prevented thousands from keeping up over the next few days. Unlike previous campaigns where soldiers purposely straggled, many just could not keep up on the march. For months, Lee's army lived on a diet that lacked a half of the necessary protein to maintain muscle mass and provided less than 2/3 the necessary calories to sustain body mass. The diet, largely a quarter pound of beef and 2 pints of coarse cornmeal and occasional small amounts of molasses, was woefully deficient in most vitamins, resulting in weakness and absorption problems of protein, minerals, and vitamins, with soldiers suffering from skin ailments, night blindness, anemia, scurvy, and diarrhea. Let me explain to you what I'm saying. They were getting such insufficient amounts of nutrition that their body couldn't break down the little nutrition they were actually consuming. In a telling assessment, Dr. J.W. Powell, medical director of the 3rd Corps, commented on the Corps inspection report in February 1865, while there was not much absolute sickness existing, there were many weak and feeble men who cannot be relied upon to undergo any great physical exertions, end quote. For 4 long years, the Army had battled overwhelming federal manpower and resources brilliantly. Close to 30,000 of them fell in combat, and more than 125,000 suffered wounds, but punish the Yankees they did. The Yankee statistics are a little slightly different from the Confederate statistics, but essentially about 4 of every 9 Union soldiers killed in action or wounded in action were at the hands of Lee's men. To give you an idea, and we're here, of course, celebrating Gettysburg, and people like to say that Gettysburg is the turning point in the war. The last year of the war, May 64 to April 65, Lee's army inflicted 127,000 casualties on the Union Army. That's an unbelievable number when you think about it. And when you think that Lee's men, roughly 200,000 of almost 1 million, inflicted 4/9 of all the casualties in the war, that's combat casualties, pretty staggering. In General Order Number 9, a farewell to his troops, Lee stated that they had been, quote, compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources, end quote. To President Davis, 10 days later, Lee blamed the, quote, moral condition, end quote, of the Army for the defeat. The operations which occurred while the troops were in the entrenchments in front of Richmond and Petersburg were not marked by the boldness and decision which formerly characterized them. Except in particular instances, they were feeble, and a want of confidence seemed to possess officers and men. This condition, I think, was produced by the state of the feeling in the country and the communications received by the men from their homes, urging their return and the abandonment of the field, end quote. Both were correct. The rebels confronted vast Union superiority, and over the course of 4 years, it wore down the Confederacy. Ultimately, the Army of Northern Virginia did not collapse because of Southern culture, industry, agriculture, slavery, motivations, manpower shortages, discontent at home, or any other solitary factor. Intense and sustained Union pressure caused serious fissures in all these areas, winnowing away that margin for error and cutting into muscle and bone, collectively bringing down the Army and the Confederacy. 4 long years of war damaged or disrupted virtually every aspect of Confederate life. The demoralization to which Lee referred was a consequence of all these problems, not a cause. Private Thomas Petty, a native Virginian and pre-war Washington, D.C. clerk who lost friendships over secession, gazed at the stars on a warm July night in 1861. Suddenly, a comet rocketed through the sky. The next day, he read in the Richmond newspapers that no one had anticipated the passing of a celestial body. He wondered what it meant. Quote, perhaps it portends or foreshadows the speedy acknowledgement of our Confederate States' independence, he pondered, and by its sudden apparition typified the Confederate States, which had come into the host of nations like the comet blazing gloriously, end quote. Petty was wrong about independence, but correct about the comet as a metaphor. In the grandeur of time, the Army of Northern Virginia, like the Confederate States of America, was a short-lived shooting star. It appeared as a powerful illumination and quickly passed into the darkness. Perhaps 200,000 or more men stepped into its ranks throughout the course of the war. Undermanned, underfed, poorly clothed, and inadequately equipped, the Army of Northern Virginia kept a significantly larger and better resourced Union Army at bay for almost 4 years. Its success was so great that in the minds of Northerners and Southerners alike, it became the symbol of the viability of the Confederate States of America. Its commander was perceived by many as a general superior to all, including Napoleon Bonaparte himself. The combination of Lee and his army have left an indelible mark on the landscape and psyche of the American nation, far beyond its 4 years. Even today, many decades after the last veteran has expired, Lee's army continues to live in the imagination of the American public, not so much for what it represented, but for what it accomplished on the field of battle under the most difficult conditions and circumstances. Thank you very much. Just one. They said one question, and I just squeezed the second one out, but they have to be quick and brief. No one? Great, we're out of here. No. Anyone have a question?
Three examples. I would like three examples of the specific things an officer...
Put that closer to your mouth, please.
Three examples that an officer could have implemented. You talked about
You got to put it close to your mouth. I
repeatedly.
can't hear you. Put the microphone right up to your mouth. There you go.
You spoke of discipline a number of times.
Yeah.
Can you give me three specific examples of things that an officer could have done?
Well, I think largely officers were not, that's a good question about discipline. Officers weren't attentive to their duty. If they let soldiers wander away from camp, they let them wander away on the march. They didn't insist that they keep up. They didn't drill them as effectively as they should have. Selected officers did a great job, so you know they could do it. But many of them didn't do it, and that resulted in all sorts of problems. And what you need to do is you need to be vigilant as an officer. You need to make sure that soldiers are preserving their supplies. You need to make sure that they're not damaging materiel, things of that nature. It's always important that you're vigilant as an officer. Anyone else?
Could you contrast the organizational skills of Robert E. Lee versus that of a general who is probably unpopular? I have an interest in him only because he was from where I'm from, Philadelphia, but George Brinton McClellan, because the way I see it, the army that eventually defeated Lee in the field was organized by a man who was generally recognized as a failure.
Okay, the question was compare Lee's organizational skills with McClellan's organizational skills. Well, McClellan has an enormous advantage, of course, because he's not organizing his troops while the fighting's going on. Lee steps in and he's got to fight. And so he doesn't really have much time to do that kind of thing. He has a few little avenues throughout the course of the war. But you also need to remember that Lee suffers what most likely is a heart attack in 1863. So he's incapacitated for quite a long time there. McClellan just has enormous advantages. But you can make the claim that it's McClellan's organization that sees it through. But the troops have turned over dramatically by then. The officers have turned over dramatically. A lot of the incompetents have been squeezed out. So it's a very different army of the one in 1864 or even the one in 1863 than the one, say, in the Peninsula Campaign. It's just a very different army. And so while I'm not gainsaying McClellan's organizational skills, there's a little more to being an Army commander than an organizer. And McClellan was an utter failure in those other aspects which are critical. I guess we're not allowed to have any more questions, so...
Thank you, Dr. Glatthaar.
Thank you for coming.